All right, now let's create our first component. So here in the source folder, let's add a new folder, components. By convention, we put all our components here. Now in the components folder, let's add a new file. We call it counter.jsx. Note that here I'm using camel notation. So the first letter of the first word should be lowercase, and the first letter of every word after should be uppercase. So if you wanted to call this file counter component, we would name it like this: counter component with a capital C. Okay. Also, I highly encourage you to use the JSX extension instead of just JS, because with this you will get better code completion. So here's our counter module. In this module, on the top, we need to import React and the component class from the React module. We can manually type it by hand, but let me show you a shortcut to generate this line. Earlier at the beginning of the course, I told you to install an extension called Simple React Snippet. So here on the extensions tab under installed, you can see I've got Simple React Snippets. This is a very powerful extension. It has a lot of shortcuts to quickly generate code. You can find all the shortcuts below. In this video, I'm going to use a couple of these shortcuts. One is IMRC for generating the import statement, and the other is CC for generating a class component. So back in counter.jsx, type IMRC, which is short for import React component, and press tab. Done. Next, type CC, which is short for create class, tab, done. And here we have multiple cursors. So what we type is reflected in both places. Let's give this component a name. So counter with a capital C. Now to stop multi-cursor editing, press the escape button. So we have this counter class that extends the component class that we imported on the top from the React module. This component class has a bunch of methods that we're going to inherit in this counter class, okay? Now, this code also generates the state property. In this video, we don't care about this. We're going to look at that later in this section. So delete it and modify the render method to return a simple H1 with the text hello world. Now to refresh your memory, what we have here is a JSX expression. It's not a string, it's a JSX expression, which eventually gets compiled to calls to react.createElement. That's why we have to import the React object on the top, even though we are not going to directly use this in our code. Okay, so let's delete this line. So we have a simple component that when rendered returns an H1 element, right? Now note that in this generated code, we're defining the class here and then exporting it separately on line 9. This is different from what I showed you in the last section where I talked about modules. There, we defined a class and exported it on the same line. So here we can do something like this: export default class counter. And then we can delete what we have on line 9. But going forward, I prefer to stick to the template that is generated by this extension, so I don't have to modify it every time. Okay, so let's revert this back. We're done with this component. Now let's use it. So save the changes. We need to go to index.js. So on the top, we can type index.js. And if you're curious how I brought up this little panel, you can find the shortcut here under the Go menu. So on Mac, it's Command and P. On Windows, I'm not sure. You need to find it yourself. So let's go to index.js. Here we need to import our counter class. So import counter from /components/counter. And note that because counter is a default export, we don't need curly braces around it. Okay. Now finally on line 9, where we are rendering a React component, instead of the app component, we're going to render our counter component. So you can see with these components, we are extending the HTML vocabulary. So wherever we have a counter element, we'll get the output of the counter component, which is determined by what is returned from the render method. Now, back in the browser, we can see our counter component rendered in the DOM properly.